I'd like to turn the floor over to my new friend, Ambassador Curtis Chin, a good friend of Anna Catalano's, as are many people in the room, and I dare say after this week, everyone in the room will be a friend of Anna Catalano's. Ambassador Chin brings a wide perspective on what has been going on in Asia over the past couple decades, as you'll hear in his presentation. But in addition to that, he has a unique perspective with respect to the relationship to the United States. So with that, Ambassador Curtis Chin.
Thanks much. Thank you. You took my notes. All right. Thank you. Hey, thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. Actually, I was an undergraduate student at Northwestern years ago, decades ago. And I'd always walk by this building. Actually, the building had a different entrance then. It was a little bit different size. And my friends and I would always wonder what really happened inside here. It was one of the few buildings where they actually had those, the doors opened automatically. So we'd always walk by, the doors would open, but we'd never come in. So how funny it is that I'm here today, and it's not so bad the people inside, because it's us. So when Rob asked me to talk about Asia today, I really wasn't really sure what to say. Asia's so big. And I thought it's almost like saying to someone, can you talk about the world, but spend only 1/4 of the time you were going to talk about the world on Asia. Right, and so I wanted to come to you today and just share with you kind of a couple perspectives on the Asia-Pacific region, and sort of my mission. We were talking about mission yesterday and this morning, is really to get you to think a little bit differently about Asia and the Pacific. This is also actually, for those of you who are Americans, this is actually also Asia American Pacific Heritage Month in the United States. And it's supposed to be a month where people learn more about Asia, and so how fitting that we're here together to talk about Asia. A little bit of context of what I bring to this session. Many people don't even know what the ADB is, let alone that the United States had an ambassador to the ADB. So I just want to put it in context for you to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. So, clearly I have an Asian face. I'm an American, but grew up throughout Asia, in Thailand, where I now live, which is kind of a crazy place right now. And of course, worked and represented our United States government, but worked in the private sector and with a couple of nonprofits as a trustee in Asia. And so what I want to share with you today are just kind of perceptions developed through the years of how Asia has changed and how Asia is changing. And I thought, I didn't have a lot of fancy slides. If I need some slides, I liked our very first speaker. How cool is it to say, we do business throughout the solar system? I mean, who can say that? So at least I can say I've done business throughout Asia, as big as that might be. It's certainly no solar system. But I love that notion of, what you think, where you can do business is maybe very different than the reality. So for those of you who've never thought you'd be engaged with Asia, there's some slides earlier that people showed that was, X at scale. And I thought, well, maybe my slide really should say Asia at scale, to give you a sense of the scale. Asia is huge. And I think one of the challenges when we talk about Asia is we need to be very clear what Asia means, to what degree it includes the countries that you're focused on, whether you're in nonprofits, whether you're in business, whether you're in government, whatever sector you're in. And I thought, well, maybe if I were to do word plays, I used to be a journalist. And I'll talk for 20 minutes, and then I think we're going to do some Q&A, Rob and I. But I'll talk 20 minutes, and you'll really never remember what I said. From my communications background, you'll only remember 2 or 3 things. And so I'm going to spell out over the course of this next 15 minutes about what I'd like you to think about as you think about Asia. And I thought when I talked about Asia at scale, what does that mean? It's a scale of our ambitions, the scale of your companies, of your enterprises. So let's take a walk through Asia. When I ask people about Asia, what do they think? They really don't necessarily say innovation. They might say, well, a lot of people, poverty, China, India, always dominates people's thinking about Asia. So I kind of laughed when I saw this slide I'm going to show you. It was actually, I think it's a Reuters photograph, but the Wall Street Journal put it up online yesterday, and it's been all over various blog sites. But to me, it was kind of a funny slide, but it reflects some of the trends that I see in Asia. One thing I just flagged here on this slide, actually it's a little bit different than what's in your programs. I was just named, I want to say 3 weeks ago in Los Angeles. I'm the new Asia Fellow. I think we just made up the title. But I'm the new Asia Fellow of something called the Milken Institute out of Los Angeles. Some of you may know of Mike Milken, his long history. But those of you who might not know about him more recently, he's really done a lot in trying to focus on bringing new medicines, things to market. Faster Cures is an organization he's working with. But something else that Mike Milken has done is created something called the Milken Institute. with the belief that capital markets, you know, the old days of junk bonds, today we've got hedge funds, but we can be innovative in financing entrepreneurs and financing enterprises. And so one of the latest initiatives is Mike Milken and the Milken Institute have launched the Milken Institute in Asia. So we've just launched in Singapore, and we're not quite sure what I'm doing, but I'm his latest and first Asia fellow. And so that's what that's all about. That really isn't in your program. And the other in this changing world of when you're a US ambassador, they really tell you, don't do social media. And if you're going to do it, your public affairs office will help you with it. Then it's really not you, right? You know, we're there to advance US policy. So as a New Year's resolution, I said, okay, I'll at least go on Twitter. I'm not doing Facebook, but at least I'm Twitter. And Anna has been my model there as we tweet each other. So that's kind of my tag. But here's the photo I saw yesterday. And I thought it was kind of funny. So what is this? And the headline, to me, it's innovation, it's change. But the actual caption was pretty funny. So this is a man in China, and I don't know why, because there really wasn't a story. There was, you know, a couple paragraphs. This man in China has spent 10 years turning his suitcase into a scooter. Now, I don't know why you would do that, but this is change, this is innovation. And to me, it spoke about China, and this is the story of Asia right now, China's rise. And you know, there's so many ways we can look at China's rise, but one thing that's happening is China is more aggressive, more assertive militarily, and certainly economically. So this story was, or the story that I can see it's almost like we did a fun exercise, and I'd have you write the story. But this tells me about the problems about traffic in China, infrastructure issues, pollution, and for all I know, probably authorities will clamp down on this poor guy because it's probably not licensed, his suitcase scooter. But to me, you know, these are the things that are evolving and changing in Asia. And so you know, I thought, you know, what if I had said, you know, my talk will be about changing Asia, but also I think changing Asia is changing us, whether it's changing the US or changing all of us. And I really want to encourage people to visit if they haven't visited Asia, but also to think through how can Asia also be a source of not just capital, but a source of change and innovation in your own enterprises. You know, this is actually a very special day. You know, I met today, I don't know where he is, a gentleman from Anglo-American and others from New Zealand. This is actually a very special day in the story of Asia. It's kind of an obscure story, but 61 years ago, I don't know if anyone knows what happened 61 years ago. I would argue that 61 years ago, Asia created its first Asia celebrity. So a person who wasn't the head of a country, person who wasn't, you know, someone you saw for military reasons, but just a regular guy who became a celebrity 61 years ago. And that was this man. Actually, I know his family. And this is, actually you can't even see him because of his mask. But 61 years ago, Tenzing Norgay became the first man, along with Sir Edmund Hillary of New Zealand, to climb Everest, successfully summit Everest. And so, hand out to Tenzing, hands out for New Zealand. But this also, I think, to me, reflects how different in 6 decades Asia has changed. You know, at that time, they summited Everest, but actually, it took a while for people to find out. It wasn't like he could tweet. I think he can tweet now from Everest. But at that time, the news to finally get back to some of the key sponsors back in the UK took some time. It's going by ship, you know. We're not like wiring it right away. And ultimately, Tenzing Norgay and ultimately Sir Edmund Hillary, you know, met with the Queen of England. This was part of the ceremonies for her own coronation. You know, again, how the world has changed and has not changed, that the Queen is still on the throne there. But this story really shaped people's thinking of Asia. And then in the following 5 or 6 decades, we no longer, of course, have colonies. We have things that continue to evolve and change in terms of how we perceive what goes on in Asia. But what is Asia? And so I just wanted to throw up, you know, I really don't have any slides, but I really wanted to throw up a map. And so the one on the left, if I had to do a test, I'd like ask you all to name every country. Maybe people would kind of get China and India. But you know, I've been through most of these countries. In my work with the Asian Development Bank, first, what is the ADB? You know, I met some people from the World Bank here. ADB is kind of like a sister organization. It's owned by governments. It lends to governments, primarily to finance infrastructure projects in Asia. So I visited many sewer plants and roads throughout Asia. But it's also doing things in microfinance and health, and some of the things that people here are actually talking about throughout today and yesterday. And so what was my role at the ADB? I represented the United States government under George Bush and Barack Obama. It was a role that came up under US Treasury, so I was part of the Hank Paulson and then Tim Geithner team, but voting the US position on a range of investment projects throughout Asia. And in that seat on the board, so it's a resident board in the Philippines where headquarters is, I'd vote the US position. And on that board, I saw the dynamic of the Asia today, of countries that would say that we want to get along, but in the reality, they fought each other on the board. India versus China. China versus Taiwan, or they would call it Taipei China there. And I think this is one of the trends today. And so I was joking with Anna about tweets, people don't really read anything. I'm lucky they read 140 characters. And so one message I would say, one tweet I would say, is for me the story of Asia is also now Asia's very much a real Game of Thrones. I don't know if you ever knew pop culture, and if you read the books or seen the TV show, but this is a series of books and a hit HBO TV series about contending kingdoms. Fighting, it's the legacy of history, people stabbing each other in the back. And to be honest, this is unfolding in Asia today. Asia's very real Game of Thrones is dominating the headlines right now. So we have Vietnam and China sparring over maritime issues. I've got China and the Philippines fighting. I've got China and Japan fighting. And a lot of this is unfortunately all about China. But even westward, as I look at this big map of Asia, we're seeing new hope in a way for India. So one thing that we're seeing right now is this notion of modenomics. It's funny that when people talk about Asia, really it's the story of China. And so I think 11 years ago, an economist at Goldman Sachs named Jim O'Neill kind of popularized, if not came up with this notion of the BRIC. So for those of you, who you love jargon and all, I come up with my own little BRIC. So what's the real BRIC? The BRIC is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And based on how you classify Russia, you could say, well, 3 of the BRIC are Asian nations, right? Russia, India, and China. These are the nations that Jim O'Neill from Goldman said would really dominate the next round of growth in the world. That these would be the countries that we would look to drive new job creation, that drive innovation. And so if you're a business, if you're a nonprofit, somehow you need to be in these markets. And so people always ask me, since I stepped down, I can speak my own mind. I don't worry about White House counsel or Treasury saying, don't say that. People ask me, who will be the next BRIC? Who will be this next great economy that will drive things? And will it come from Asia? And usually I won't pick a country, because usually I'm the host. I'm hosted by a government or someone. I really don't want to offend them. And they always want me to say their country. So last Thursday, I think I was in Jakarta. And of course, they would want me to say Indonesia. But I say, I worry less about who will be that next BRIC. I worry more about the little BRIC. And the little BRIC is something that I encourage you to think about as you look at your own institutions and think about how you can change and make it better, but also as you think about all these countries in Asia. So the little BRIC is not a single place. The little BRIC for me are 4 things. I don't say they're 4 concepts. They're 4 very real challenges I find. First one, little b, bureaucracy. Asia is the story also of bureaucracy. Some will say, the Chinese claim to have invented everything. But certainly one thing they invented was the notion of a bureaucracy, of Mandarins who would take this test to become leaders in government. But for me, bureaucracy isn't just about bureaucrats in government. It's about this notion how it takes forever to get things done in places. In my own company, my own clients, bureaucracy is one of the biggest challenges for growth. So how can we as individuals change that and address that? And actually, when you look at Asia, some countries are actually very successful. When you look at rankings by Heritage Foundation, World Economic Forum, high up on the list in terms of effectiveness of government will be places like Singapore, will be places like Hong Kong, very competitive. New Zealand actually does very well on a lot of these rankings. So bureaucracy. My second R is a little bit, my little R is a little bit more controversial, because really I'm a libertarian at heart. Just do what you want, I don't really care. Just don't bother me. Is regulation. When I look at Asia sometimes, I'm looking at it in terms of the regulations that either can aid or hurt economic growth and job creation. And so we see a lot of places that are so regulated. In some ways, Singapore is regulated. So this is where I'm not saying regulation is good or bad. But when I meet with finance officials, when I meet with businesses, I said the key is the right balance, but also that people are treated equally. And so when you come to Asia, you'll find that if you're a foreign company, if you're a foreigner, sometimes you'll be treated very differently. Regulations will apply very differently to you. Little I, interventions by government. And Asia, again, across the board, they're more welcoming than I'd say here we are in the United States about interventions by government. You know, I was at Treasury at a time where it seemed like we were buying everything. You know, we bought a stake in Citi, General Motors, AIG. You know, we can argue over whether that was right or wrong. But for me, interventions by government, interventionism, really should be a last resort. It should not be the first model and choice for growing an economy. And so, you know, all these things, bureaucracy, regulation, intervention, it's a question of balance. And so when you come to a specific Asian country and look at this question of balance, you'll find that sometimes it's way overboard. You know, China, India intervene tremendously in their economies. And perhaps it's good for them, but it certainly isn't good for US and other competitors there. So sometimes it's a search for balance. But my last one, my little c, I would argue that there's really no need for, and that is corruption. And this is one of the biggest challenges in Asia, Asia and the Pacific today, corruption. So when you look at how do you measure corruption, there's something called the Transparency International Perceptions of Corruption Index. It's really a lagging indicator of, you know, if you were doing business in X country, how corrupt do you think the government is? And some places, again, Singapore, Hong Kong, really not corrupt at all. But other places, so much worse. You know, I think way down on the list are places like Burma. Actually, you know, now I can say Myanmar. When you were a U.S. government official, you're not even allowed to say Myanmar. It's like the country whose name you couldn't say. But Burma, a place going through tremendous change in Asia, where the rules are still being written. So all these countries, when you look at this map, I think ADB classifies something like 48, 49 countries as Asia-Pacific nations. With some, I don't know, I think it's like 4.2 billion people they classify as Asia. It's like 60% of the overall 7 billion people in the world. So from this, you know, great, vast continent, ideas are coming. Challenges are coming, but hopefully opportunities are coming for each and every one of you. You know, one thing that I say to people as I work with them in Asia is that institutions, markets are changing. You also have to change with them. You know, the latest example of China's really assertiveness is the president there has announced his plans for an Asia infrastructure bank, capitalized at $50 billion, which will fund infrastructure throughout the region. And really, you have to look at it in a political context. So one reason they're possibly doing this, it's a challenge to Japan's leadership of the ADB. That Japan actually, for all intents and purposes, really pushes the policy, the investments of the Asian Development Bank. China won't have that anymore. And so when we talk about change throughout this day and a half so far, something that struck me was it seems like everyone's talking about kind of the process, how do we create change, how do we do change? But for me, what I was struck with as kind of an outsider was that all these kind of conversations seem to assume we want the same change. But I think China's message to the world is the change you want isn't necessarily the change we want. So who are you, the West, the US, whoever it is, Japan, to say this is the change we'll move for? You know, that last panel before lunch was great, but for me, I reacted. You know, I come from Thailand, where let's talk about change. I think I flew there from Japan 7 days ago. When I got there, I had martial law. Then I flew to Jakarta. I flew back to Thailand. Then I had a coup, and so I got a different prime minister right now. That's change. But what's interesting about Thailand is that change that's taken place, the military coup, is supported probably by like the Thai version of us. It's supported by the middle class. It's supported by the educated. It's supported by the elite. It's supported by much of academia. And so it's funny when, you know, as kind of an American, we're for liberal democracy. But here's a place, the elite don't want democracy. They want to make sure they're ruled by the people that in their minds are just like them. So what is the change that the Thai people want? Very different than what we outsiders, you know, we have now like US, EU statements about Thailand has to go back to democracy. But shouldn't each country set its own path forward? You know, that's my own belief. But in what way, in saying that each country finds its own way, are we actually encouraging something that we really don't want to happen? And so for this Chinese Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Japanese have had to say, well, we welcome it, but we hope that bank will also follow environmental standards, respect for indigenous peoples, all these social safeguards that other institutions do. But that's very much a Western model of development. And China, to its great credit, has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Really, if you come to Asia and you travel in Asia, don't just stay at the Four Seasons in Tokyo or go to Hong Kong. Asia, it has, I think, the figure from the ADB is 2/3 of the most poor people in the world. So these are people who make them less than $1.25 a day. These people live in Asia. And a lot of them are less poor today because of China, just because of the numbers. As China has lifted people out of poverty, the numbers, the reality have gone down. And China, to its great credit, has said, we've done this, and we didn't do it because of World Bank loans. It wasn't because of an ADB grant, but in my mind, it's because they freed up the Chinese people to be business people, to be entrepreneurs, to let them do what they want to do. And so that's what I hope the Chinese will take as a message from their own development versus what the West encourages and supports isn't quite right for that area. Just to wrap before we do some Q&A, I would say that, the other thing I've been asked about, recently I just did an interview, and they asked me what did I think about something called the BRICS Bank, this BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They've added to their list South Africa as another economy that will help drive the world. And these now 5 nations have proposed their own bank to kind of fund development and not follow this Western model. And so we'll see if it happens. If these countries can work together, all the better. I think we all benefit by countries working together. And so for my own little BRIC, I had to come up with an S. When I do these talks, what's my S? And so sometimes I'll do workshops with CEOs and their leadership team, and I'll challenge them. I made up my own little b, little r, little I, little c, little s. But if you thought of your own company, your own organization, I forced you to think of a concept holding back your growth and development. What would you have as that BRIC? And so for my little s, really the story of Asia today is also one, sadly, of growing sectarianism, a growing divide in many nations. The one that's most in the newspapers is Burma, is Myanmar, where people want to invest. It's a great market, but that country is sadly still being torn apart by ethnic tensions, by religious tensions. But that's a story throughout the region. And so this is also the challenge of democracy. That, as we lift off that kind of dictatorial kind of lid, will all these tensions blow up? So, I'm long-term bullish on Asia. I'm long-term bullish for America as an Asia-Pacific nation, always being engaged in Asia. But in the short term, it's not a happy story right now in Asia. It's a story of a Game of Thrones. It's a story of Asian urbanization. I think China has 160 cities of over 1 million people. All right? And so if you just look at the scale, the raw numbers that we're talking about, these are pressing challenges that many other countries, in our part of the world, the Americas, don't necessarily have. So, I wanted to close with that, just to give you a broader perspective of, how diverse Asia is, the challenges, what I want you to think about as you come by and you come visit. But I really just want to also, with Rob, have a couple questions. And I think you're Oprah, and I don't know, I'm the guest.
I've never been called Oprah, Curtis, but I'm flattered nonetheless. So thank you. So you set up a lot of topics for us to discuss, and we only have about 13 minutes to do that. But you mentioned China. Let's jump into that. I mean, that's the biggest. A lot revolves around China and has for 3,000 years. So looking at your BRIC, I remember about 10 years ago, a very, very famous Chinese economist, there are some of those that are serious, and he's serious, and I won't tell you who it is, because he said this in confidence in a room of about 60 people not being videotaped. We were talking about corruption. And a lot of Western executives, some Chinese executives, people from around Asia who's in Hong Kong. And he cut the conversation after about a half an hour. And he said, I'm not going to say anything more about this topic. By the way, at the time he was working for the government in Beijing. And he said, but I will summarize my perspective and then we'll move on to something else. He said, if you eliminate corruption, you eliminate the Communist Party. And we had a reaction somewhat similar to the one that you have right now. What are your thoughts about it? I mean, what does this corruption thing mean? We all know it's there. We all have dealt with it if we do business in China. What does it mean? How do we deal with it?
Well, again, if you're the average Chinese, it's daily life. I think I can't speak, of course, for the Chinese government or the party there. They know it's a serious challenge, and this is why the new president, President Xi, has said this will be one of his core priorities. But the reality is that every time there's a new president in China, they say corruption is one of their core priorities, and does it just become a political kind of vendetta against the people that they need to take care of, and those are the people that are prosecuted, versus addressing the underlying system. But I would say, corruption, it's all relative. I don't think the U.S. is necessarily, the least corrupt. If you look at this transparency,
Illinois is a pretty clean state.
I'll leave you to comment on that. But I remember when I looked at the Transparency International data, I think the United States is like the 17th least corrupt country. But if you hear some of the people in Asia, very respected leaders, like the former head of Singapore, he would argue that corruption, it's how you define it, because some people will say that just because it's legal, it doesn't mean it isn't corrupt. So an example being, is lobbying in Washington, going back to one of the earlier panels, is lobbying simply institutionalized legal corruption? I would argue that there's a big gap between how the Chinese do corruption and our regulated lobbying process. But I take the point, which is, again, if we talk about can people have a real impact on how they're governed, policies that impact them, who is representing the regular person. Yeah. So this is a big challenge for China right now.
So whether it's related to the new BRIC that you shared, the Little BRIC, or something else, if you're a foreign business, non-Chinese business, could be US, Europe, Latin America, whatever, and you're doing business in China now, as many of us are, what are the main issues you would be looking out for over the next few years? You said it's not necessarily a happy story in the short term.
Sure.
So bullish on the long run, not happy short term. What should we be paying attention to?
Well, I was just giving you an example of, there's 160 cities of more than 1 million people. I think companies that are serious about China have to realize there's more to China than Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, right? And again, the scale is amazing there. The raw numbers. But I also say to people, when people ask me this question, it goes back to when people want me to say, can you name my country as part of your big BRIC? I do say to people that I think the United States and maybe much of the world doesn't pay enough attention to Southeast Asia. That it's all about China, it's all about India. But we have 10 nations under this Association of Southeast Asian Nations, including where I live in Thailand, or also where I live in Indonesia, that have great potential for businesses, for nonprofits. Bangkok is kind of like a UN hub, but for areas that get engaged and that go beyond China and India. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that, and a lot of people don't know this, and my Indonesian friends would be happy for me to mention that Indonesia is the 4th largest country in the world by population. A lot of people are surprised by that, and of course ASEAN itself has a very large population. So talk about that sphere a little bit. I mean, where are the opportunities and challenges in the ASEAN space? If you were navigating, for instance, you wanted to grow in the ASEAN space, where would be the best base of business? Is it Singapore or is it elsewhere?
Singapore, of course, has rule of law, and that's critical to a business. The rules that apply to you today are going to be the same rules that will apply to you tomorrow.
Right.
So Singapore is really, the key hub for regional headquarters. I mean, the other one, of course, is Hong Kong, another great place with great rule of law. But Singapore really is the financier for much of Southeast Asia. And I recall when the United States, the EU, had sanctions on the Burmese government, on Myanmar. Really, they did banking still through Singapore. Asia didn't apply sanctions to Burma. It was the West that did, and now everyone's trying to rush in. So I would say when I look at the 10 nations of Southeast Asia, they range from a little old Brunei, a little old Singapore, to the big players, which are Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. But also opportunities abound in Vietnam. But again, in each of these places, if I were to look and grade each one on my notion of the Little BRIC, some are more bureaucratic, some are more corrupt. But I think Americans, Europeans, everyone, you need to show up. You need to be there and you need to be engaged. And so when you introduced me, you talked about some perceptions I might have about the United States and Asia. I think the feeling, unfortunately, in Asia is that this so-called Asia pivot, whether it's real or not, has been primarily about defense. What I advocate for is that America needs to be engaged in Asia, not just through military means, but we need a business pivot to Asia. We need an educational pivot to Asia. We need a cultural pivot to Asia. You know, the Chinese are here in the United States financing something called the Confucius Institute to try and get people to speak Mandarin. You know, good thing. But you know, why isn't the United States doing similar things? And if people say, well, we in the United States don't necessarily have the money that we want to spend on these things, this is an opportunity to be creative, to be innovative, and change how we fund, we staff this so-called pivot to Asia, where this is an opportunity for a public-private partnership, for the United States business community to be working with other groups out there, where then Americans, business people, regular people are the face of our pivot to Asia. It's not just our military. As great as our military might be in terms of the natural disaster, you know, helping countries, that alone should not be the face of the U.S., and too often it is right now.
And I can tell you from my limited, compared to you, time there, when the states of the United States send people, when businesses visit, I mean, there's a lot of excitement and interest in spending time with them, particularly in Southeast Asia. Absolutely. Also in China, although it's a little bit more challenging because now everyone's going to China. Yeah. And they're sort of picking their partners in a sense. It's very difficult to make money in China. Sure. So what else could we do? I like this notion of the business, educational, cultural pivot to Asia. That can't just be done by the United States government. So what can companies and organizations in this room accomplish?
I think kin should be everywhere.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm all for that.
But no, kin is a great example of where business leaders, you know, I met so many great, fascinating people, you know, in this room from all dimensions of the world, but also all dimensions of different sectors. And if we can kind of replicate that in Asia, I want to meet, where did he go? I want to meet the guy.
Ken ASEAN?
Ken ASEAN, right?
Jackie Musu, right here.
I want to talk to you later. But I think this is an example, and to be honest, this is one reason why the Milken Institute has opened up a center in Singapore. You know, Asia is hot, you know, both, not just temperature-wise, but it's the focus of so much attention now because money talks is the reality. It's kind of the sad reality of things about how do I influence an organization. Money allows you to influence policy, right? Like we've been saying today, you got to almost use the system to change the system. Right? And so right now, people ask me, well, why in Southeast Asia are they, you know, polluting the Mekong River, or are they talking about damming the river? And it's because they're getting financing, unfortunately, for these kinds of things, right? And unless financing changes, it'll continue, right? Because money is what's dictating what's happening. And to defend how Asia has developed, you know, it's easy for us to be sitting in London or New York or in Evanston, Illinois, and say, you should be worried about all these things. Yeah. But I don't know, 300 million people in my country, or, you know, 80 million people in Thailand. So many of them are so poor and they just want to live a simpler, better life. What is that right balance that you always keep telling me about? But it's hard to have that balance when my kids are hungry. Right. So you know, I really, as you think about Asia, I would encourage you to put yourselves in their shoes. And too often, whether it's the U.S. Government or somebody else, too often I think our constructive suggestions for change come out as preaching and hypocrisy. And so I think we need to also kind of live the change that we preach to people. And for me, a very real example, a big challenging kind of new direction I had was, you know, I began under President Bush. I continued under President Obama. And for the most part, there was no difference in policy. And I hope that's because at least our support for the poorest and least developed nations in this world is non-political. It's bipartisan. But where things changed was I was directed to vote against every project at the bank that involved coal. And for Asians, it was a very difficult understanding. When we, the United States, I don't know what the figure is, 40%, we use a lot of coal to power our country. Right. But now we're telling people you can't use coal, and we're not going to give you a way to get cheaper energy. You just can't use coal, right? And for, I think, both bank staff and Asian nations, there was a little bit of hypocrisy there. The goal is right. You know, we don't want, you know, pollution everywhere. Right. But then we're not working with them to find a solution. We're just telling them what not to do. And so for me, it was funny because we tried to work with the bank, and, you know, my direction from, you know, White House and others were, no, tell them that coal is okay if there's also kind of a counterbalancing reduction in greenhouse gases. All conceptually great, but then bank staff would say to me, do you mean on the same project? So if I'm doing a project that's generating all these emissions on that same project, or is it somewhere else? Right. And there was no guidance from Washington. It was that you can only tell them this talking point. that there must be counterbalancing. And so people are confused sometimes about a lack of consistency, even in the advice, or lack of specificity. And it's almost like, I think one of the sessions, so many terrific sessions in this, Kin, but one of the sessions was, you can have all the strategy you want, but where's the implementation, right? And where are you helping me implement it versus just telling me you got to do this? Right. I think this is Asia's feeling sometimes right now when we see the U.S.
We have had a history, and I love America to death. It's my country, it will always be my country, but we do have a history of coming across as a little hypocritical sometimes. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes not. So one last question, Curtis. You are in many ways an uber-Kinian. If you look at your background and what you've done in the world, the variety of roles you've played, the breadth of your experience, it's really quite impressive and exciting, and we're so pleased to have you here. What's next for Curtis Chin?
That's a good question. I'm always, I feel that I'm always learning. I'm always, we had that great session yesterday where we each had like 4 minutes to talk about what is our mission in life and how do you help me achieve that mission.
By the way, it was 2 minutes.
2 minutes. We had 4 people or so we had that extra allocation.
Okay, good.
But at that session, I said I really would love to continue to be able to take my knowledge of Asia, of emerging markets, of high growth markets, and continue to shape policy and shape companies, whether it's at the board level or as I'm a consultant sometimes, or even just speaking here and trying to get people to think differently. And so, I show up a lot in media, now I'm tweeting, but hopefully someone reads it or pays attention. But more importantly, hopefully that they take something out of it that will change them. And I want to just close in case, people always, cut what you say down to like 10 seconds. But I do want to say I have such great faith in the I'm an American, in the United States. But I think it's important that the U.S. also lead. That I'm not a big fan of this leading from behind, but that we got to lead. And I can tell you the story of Asia today is not one now of we don't want the Americans here. It's more one of what happened to the Americans because the Chinese are here.
Right.
And I think, to be honest, it shouldn't be the U.S. versus China. It should be how do we each bring something to the table to bring Asia forward. That China is not the enemy of the U.S., but clearly different approaches to different things. But I rather people look at both approaches and say, well, if I'm developing Thailand, the model should not be one of let's just pollute everything to death and then later on we'll figure that out. But can we slowly move forward and take some lessons from the United States? Because ultimately, I think this century will be an Asia-Pacific century. No offense to all my European new friends. But remember, the United States, the United States is very much an Asia-Pacific nation. And so, to close, I would say don't think of Asia as a geography. Think of Asia also as a mindset. It's a youthful continent. It's a changing continent. And if we can capture that, whatever your age is or whether or not you think you can change, if you take that mindset from Asia, I think we'll all do much better in whatever career path that we find before us.
Well, thank you, Curtis. This notion of the business, educational, cultural pivot to Asia is compelling. I mean, we certainly can't forget or lose focus on the powerful relationships we have in Europe and Latin America, other parts of the world. Those will continue to evolve as well. But the notion of pivot causes me to think about how many geopolitical relationships are pivoting right now. So you look in your own continent in Asia and you see China becoming newly assertive in terms of territorial claims, rocks in the ocean, and other things, and taking on every country at the same time, which seems to be against its own strategic interests. But there are definitely internal factors that are driving that kind of behavior. You look in Europe, which was just in Finland with Karina Koskinen-Luste, who's here somewhere, a couple months ago, and of course you can imagine the conversation was deep about Russia and what's going on in the transitions in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, etc. And so there is a need for America. There is a need for that ideal for which we stand. You mentioned that earlier. Someone on the panel earlier today mentioned this notion of the ideal. And we miss the ideal sometimes, but it is our job to aspire to that and do our best.
And that's where I think Kin is great, to challenge us to think differently. I'm going to plug one piece that just came out today in a Korean newspaper I wrote with the son of Tenzing Norgay. So we wrote a piece about kind of what are the lessons that we should take from this. I don't know if people follow Nepal, but I'd say about, 4 weeks ago, we had the worst accident ever on Everest. 16 people died, 16, I think 13 were technically Sherpa ethnicity, but let's say there's 16 were the Sherpa community died. And at base camp, all the fancy, probably wealthy, but people who paid $60,000, $70,000 to the climb, they were all safe. And so I said, is there a lesson from this for all of us? And this year was also the 1-year anniversary of another terrible disaster. Asia has so many disasters, to be honest. But a year ago, there was a factory in Bangladesh called Rana Plaza. This factory collapsed, killing, I think, 1,100 people. After it, the foreign companies that had outsourced production there said, oh, we're going to change things. We're going to pay money to the survivors. We're going to upgrade the standards there. 1 year later, it's out of the headlines, but really it wasn't done. Right, and so Dami Norgay and I wrote this piece arguing that hopefully we talk a lot about supply chains, but whether it's a manufacturing supply chain or it's the person that cleans our car or puts the ropes in when you want to climb Everest, I think we need to respect each other more, and we need to come up with a code of ethics that respects everyone, no matter where they are on the labor force. And hopefully there'll be some changes out of this. To be honest, we're a little bit skeptical about whether changes will come unless government, business, and others come together on this.
Well, as we heard from Larry Lessig, we must continue to strive.
Absolutely.
And Curtis, I have to say, getting to know you a little bit this week, I couldn't think of anyone better to be carrying the American flag in Asia for us. I appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.